Dear viewers, welcome to a new episode of the Arab Identity, the program from which we launch a platform to re-understand our identity and defend it in the face of the challenges it faces and question its re-emergence with a new, hopeful awakening. We have defined previously the Arab identity, and we say that the Arab person is not only the one who belongs to an Arab nation or speaks the Arabic language or belongs to an Arabic tribe, but also he or she who belongs to the Arab identity emotionally or culturally, and that it is a non-ethnic and a cross-ethnic, non-geographical identity. And we went through the history of Arab identity through the various Islamic empires till the Ottoman Empire. In the last episode, I spoke with Dr. Tarek Ramadan introducing the topic of Al-Nahda, the Arab Renaissance or awakening, and touched on the different aspects of that awakening. Today, I'm honored to introduce a guest who is one of the top Arab American academics in the country and one of the experts on the subject of Al-Nahda, Professor Tarek El-Ariss. Tarek El-Ariss is a professor and chair of Middle Eastern Studies at Dartmouth College. Working across disciplines and languages, his research interests include contemporary Arabic culture, literature and art, new media and cyber culture, digital humanities, Nahda literature, language, press and literary theory, travel writing and the war novel, film and television studies, sci-fi and utopia studies, 18th and 19th century French philosophy and literature, gender and sexuality studies, and psychoanalysis, deconstruction, and affect theory. He is author of Trials of Arab Modernity, Literally Effects and the New Political and Leaks, Hacks and Scandals, Arab Culture in the Digital Age, and also the editor of the MLA anthology, The Arab Renaissance, a bilingual anthology of the Nahda, which I have here with me. The Nahda awakening, and I'm taking this from Dr. Tariq's book, The Arab Renaissance, designates the project of Arab cultural and political modernity from the early 19th to the early 20th century. Arab models of nationalism and secularism, as well as Islamic revival, spring from Nahda's thought and its attendant developments such as linguistic reform, translation, the emergence of new literary genres such as the novel, the creation of periodicals, journalism, and a new publishing industry, professional associations and salons, a new education system, and an overall enlightenment ideal of knowledge. The Nahda ushered in innovative modes of reading and writing along with new social practices of knowledge transmission, transnational connections, and new political ideas. Collected in his anthology are texts by, I have to hold it with the other hand, are texts by intellectuals, writers, members of the clergy, and political figures. The authors discuss authority, social norms, conventions, and practices both secular and religious, gender roles, class, travel, and technology. Presented in the original Arabic and an English translation, the texts will be of interest to students of the Arabic language and culture, history, cultural studies, gender studies, and other disciplines. Highly recommended for every Arab American who's interested in studying their identity, and also for any person who's interested in studying Arab Renaissance and literature. Before introducing the professor, in traditional scholarship, the Nahda is seen as connected to the cultural shock brought on by Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798 and the reformist drive of subsequent rulers such as Muhammad Ali of Egypt. However, more recent scholarship has shown that Nahda's cultural reform program to have been as autogenetic as it was Western inspired. We're going to talk in more depth about that and many more topics, and exploring and going over some of the men and women who have created the Arab Renaissance and have created with that the Arab modernity. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Tarek El-Ariss to the studio. Welcome, Doctor.
Thank you, Wissam. Thank you for this invitation. I'm very honored and I'm very happy to be here.
Doctor, first of all, I would like to ask you about your favorite translation of the word Nahda. It has been called various things, the awakening, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, Arab modernity. There isn't a consistent one word that is used across academia and just translation in general. What is your favorite?
Well, I like them all actually, and I don't think we need to choose necessarily. I think all of them capture the different facets of what this Nahda, this awakening that is also very much historically could be compared to the European Renaissance with Martin Luther, with the Reformation, with the printing press. But also the word Renaissance has also kind of traveled. You have the Harlem Renaissance in the American context. So the word Renaissance also has been used to designate a kind of a period of cultural enlightenment, because the other word is also enlightenment that comes here, tanwir in Arabic, which is also important, that also comes to us from the 18th century. So I'm not really kind of a purist in terms of identifying terms, because I think terms depend on their usages, and people have been using these terms, and they are all therefore part of the discourse on the Nahda. So I think the anthology. Thank you for introducing it, but this is also meant to create a comparative framework, especially for people who are not experts in the field, who would like to learn about this period of cultural enlightenment, political modernity that we normally associate with the Nahda. So the word Renaissance in the title is also to create a kind of a comparative framework for people to also situate this as part of human history, a larger global history that involves Arab, European, other also participants in these forms of enlightenment projects, if you like.
Right. Do you by that compare the Arab Renaissance to the European Renaissance that happened 300 years before the Arab Renaissance?
Well, there are definitely, the printing press, this is the major, and the translation, for instance, in the Arab world, one of the major Renaissance figures translated the Bible to Arabic, like Butros al-Bustani, like Ahmed Faris Shadyak, so the translation projects, the kind of rendering, moving from manuscript to a publication industry, starting with Bulaq, for instance, in Egypt, under Muhammad Ali. So, and then, of course, the printing presses in the Levant, and that begin to spread. So this idea of the availability of books, and the circulation of ideas, journals, all these, and what they led to in terms of developing a new way of thinking about our place in the world, about our relation to power, about our relation to the past tradition, but also our relation to religion, and how people being kind of encouraged to learn and to read for themselves, rather than having the clergy interpret or ask them to repeat certain things. So it is also about kind of gaining the means to discover for oneself, and think critically, and understand from religious texts to literature, and therefore also to create and to contribute to that thought process, to that kind of collective enlightenment project.
Right. So we'll get back in a few minutes to the role of Europe and the birth of the Arab awakening. But before that, so the age before the Nahda, it was called the Age of Decadence, the Age of Al-Inhitat. And I was trying to do some sort of analysis a few days ago about Asr al-Inhitat, and tried to find out when would I consider that Asr al-Inhitat started. that the Age of Decadence started. What do you think?
So, I mean, I, I, I'm not a historian, so I have to say that I'm not very, it's not that important to identify an actual moment. Because the way we talk about the inhitat or the age of decadence, it's always from a moment in the present, or not the so near past, not those so far past, but it's a way of interpreting what happened at a certain time in history, in the culture. And so that's an interpretation. That's after the fact. And this interpretation is usually done by some people who have certain ideas in mind. So they say, oh, look at us today, or where we need to be today, but look where we were 400 years ago. I can't believe we were in this situation. So that, compared to where we were, now we are in an age of enlightenment, and that is an age of inhitat. You see, so these kinds of these kinds of binaries of decadence and enlightenment, or tradition and modernity, we have to take them with some grain of salt. They are important, and we need to acknowledge that a lot of scholars and thinkers have adopted these ideas and have produced them, but also we need to understand that they are produced, that they are constructed, and they are not realities, they are not absolute. And therefore, we cannot, with all honesty and objectivity, say this is when it started. Now, of course, those who thought in those terms, attribute the decadence to, the Ottoman, the supremacy of the Turkish language, the kind of decadence of Arabic. Although, of course, there are a lot of historians and scholars who are now saying, well, no, actually, Arabic language was still thriving. There's great literature also coming out in the 18th century from Egypt. In the anthology, there is Germanus Farhat, who wrote one of the most important Arabic grammar books at the beginning of the 18th century, in like the early 1700s. So definitely, language is a very important aspect of this, decadence or awakening. And language has played a key role, because of course language is its identity. You're interested in identity. Language is the most essential component of identity, especially the Arabic language, the preservation of Arabic language, the standardization of Arabic language as a language that, we can all, producing a grammar book is about standardization. It's about creating rules that we all have to follow. We all participate in the way we express ourselves, our ideas, but also the way we write our history and we imagine our future. So that's why that the kind of the decadence was associated with kind of the decline in Arabic science. I mean, compared to Baghdad, the Abbasid Baghdad, for instance,
right?
Of course. So, but that's also the waning of cultural and political power of Arabic, or the Arabs. Although the Arabs, obviously, like a lot of the Baghdad caliphs already had Turkish and Persian. I mean, the Arab ethnic has never even at the time of Baghdad was not even like pure or the defining characteristics of Arab or Arabness. So that's why I think the question of language is very important, and people thought that the kind of demise of Arabic, but also the shift of political power and Arabic as the language of power, as the language of the administration, that's very important. Okay. Because what the people who come in the Nahda are trying to kind of work through these Arabic revival projects, and that's very important.
Okay, I'll come back to this a little bit at the end, because I have a question that relates that past and dividing line and drawing the characteristics of such a thing as a decadence and such a thing as a Renaissance, and how does it relate to us today. So I'll try to talk about this a little bit at the end. But going back now to the beginning of the Renaissance, and the influence of there seems to be two narrations, and they don't have to be an opposite narrations. They can actually coexist. That the Arab Renaissance was, induced from Europe, and there is a narration that the Arab Renaissance was born out of an evolution of the Arab traditions and being challenged by the Turkanization of the nations. What do you say about that?
Well, like you said, I think it's both, and they don't contradict. They don't contradict each other. I think you had already, like what I was saying, Germans Farhat was already, like, before Napoleon, 100 years before Napoleon, was already thinking in Nahda terms, and already engaged in Nahda projects. So, and you have Aleppo in the 18th century, major kind of center for cultural production in the region. So it's not. You had also political movements in Egypt, the Hammamiyya. I mean, you had various forms of political awareness also that were being developed. But that is also at the same time, or that eventually Napoleon's invasion and the kind of exchange with Europe, the wars, colonialism, it's not just simply kind of a lot of scholars think about it in terms of, okay, it was a shock that they had to react, and this reaction produces either we borrow from the West or we hold on to our tradition. So that's kind of the binary that I try to critique in my book, because actually someone like Tahtawi, like someone like, he was an imam from the Azhar who went to Paris in 1826. So he goes and then spends 5 years in France, Egyptian, and then he comes back, and the first thing he does, he starts editing in Bulaq, like the modern printing press that they established. He starts editing the classics of Arabic language. He starts editing, Ibn Manzur, Lisan al-Arab, the major kind of, lexicon of the classical period. So, I mean, this is not simply someone who's just simply translating European thoughts and trying to communicate them to an Arab audience. He's also, like, the encounter with Europe is also generating a kind of a return and a dissemination and a spread of the classical, the classics of Arabic, and in the case of Tahtawi, also Islamic thought. And we see he wrote this book called تخليص الإبريس في تاريخ باريس. I mean, these books rhymed, which means like the extraction of gold from the history of Paris. And he's quoting Mutanabbi, he's quoting he's quoting the poets. This is his training as an Azhar scholar, but also he's trying to translate or engage with the thinkers. I mean, he learned French, so he's bringing this kind of, on the one hand he's describing Paris and the institutions of the French that he's seeing in the 1820s and 1830s, and on the other hand he's talking about Farabi, the author of Al-Madina Al-Fadila, one of the most important Islamic philosophers, thinkers, polymath. And so here we're reading this trip to Europe, but we're also discovering a lot about the Arabic heritage, about Islamic philosophy, and that's why I'm saying, like, it's a complicated picture. Like these Nahda figures are, they are, they're bringing in, I don't want to say it's fusion, but I mean, they're bringing in, the Nahda is for me is an attitude, it's an awareness, it's an attempt, it's an awareness that there is a spirit of progress, that there is something out there that we need to be doing. I mean, and you see a lot of these authors talk about Gil, talk about the Taraqi, talk about, all these notions of progress, of civilization. So they're aware that there is a new century and they have to be part of it. They have to be agents of change. So there is an awareness of changing, of rising to the occasion. Whether this is the place of Europe in this model is not always fixed, and it changes from one person to another. Like for Tahtawi, he's very interested in what he saw in France and the kind of political institution, and he's trying to bring Islam, and he's trying to think of an Islamic way of life that combines the Enlightenment European projects that he's observing, and thinking about adab, as kind of an ethical practice, that, or the city, how do we live in a city, in an urban environment, in an ethical way, in a way that, that is true to who we are, but also that is incorporating a lot of what he's seeing and experiencing in Europe. So it's, again, this kind of, it's not an either or, it's really this exchange, it's really this complementarity, the simultaneity that we need to keep thinking about. And the tradition, that's why when we think about the Arabic tradition, when we say words like Arabic tradition or Islamic tradition, I mean, in many ways, this encounter with Europe is also making us think that this is tradition and this is modern. Do you see what I mean? Like, so tradition is not something fixed in the past that is simply accessed. It is also something that is relative, produced at a certain time. We become aware of it as our tradition at a certain time, and we start curating. We start saying, okay, we need Ibn Manzur. Oh, we need Fairuz Abadi. Muhit al-Muhit. This is Shidyaq's project, Faris Shidyaq. So I mean, you go back to those scholars, those Hariri, Maqamat. I mean, you go back to a certain tradition that you feel you need to go back to in order to find a language to describe what you are experiencing in the present. Like, this is Shidyaq's project. Shidyaq, Ahmed Faris Shidyaq, who's from Mount Lebanon, but lived most of his life in exile between Malta and Tunis and England, and then eventually he settled in Constantinople, in Istanbul, and Shidyaq was looking for, he's very interested in language. He's very interested in translation. He's one of the people who translated the Bible, worked with Protestant missionaries to translate the Bible. So a word like box, he saw the box, the boxing practice. Okay, he discovered that in England, and he said, okay, how am I going to translate this to Arabic? And he went to the classical lexicon and to the jazr, to the, the three-letter roots of Arabic words. And he found this jazr.
I hear you, doctor.
I'm sorry. So he went and found the word lakama, which is like to punch. And this is where we end up with a word like mulakama, which is boxing in Arabic. So here is a very modern concept, or very modern practice, but it's going to these lexicons, these traditional lexicons, to produce new words to contain the modern. And the same for the word socialism, ishtirakiyya. This is also something that Shidyaq translated. Going back to the roots of sharaka, 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 sharika, all these kind of different words that gave us company, the word company, the word socialism eventually. So what I'm trying to say is that this relation between the classical, or what we think is the tradition, or the classical heritage, is also essential to the modern projects. They are kind of working together. There is a complementarity in this process.
Do you notice, doctor, and this is a little bit outside the subject of history, but you are not a historian, like you said, so you'll enjoy them too. That if we compare and contrast the immigrants of today to the immigrants of the age of the Renaissance, since we we are immigrants or children of immigrants to also Western countries. Notice that many of the immigrants who immigrated to France, they formed Al-Arabiya Al-Fatad. They ended up with Al-Mu'tamar Al-Arabi, the first Arab Congress, Congress. And then also you have persons like Rafa' al-Tahtawi and Muhammad Abdu. When they go to Paris, they formulate theories, and they create a narrative that kind of merges and homogenizes the West with the East, and it kind of تلقح يعني it kind of gives a new soul to the knowledge that they already have. And then you also have the immigrants who came to the United States, and they formed the Rabat al-Qalamiyya, the Pen League, which ended up having a huge influence on the Arab world. Are we today, the Arab immigrants to the Western countries, are we playing the same role? Can we play the same role? Is there a hope that we will also play a part in a new renaissance in our Arab countries?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think also not only in the US, look at Brazil. I mean, you can, Arabic journals, people kept publishing in Arabic for a very, very long time. Boston. So definitely, I mean, I think we continue to do that. We continue to do that. And of course, my other interest is Arabic culture in the digital age and the age of satellite televisions and WhatsApp, and where you leave, but you also have access to. Because back then they left, and they some of them never came back, or they came back after 20 years and didn't know if their parents were still dead or alive, or I mean, so it was a different kind of immigration. It was much more harsh and radical, and so it's much easier for us to be connected and to go back and forth and to live in multiple places at the same time. That's, of course, that's good and bad, because and I think in general, I think that's good. Although COVID showed us that this movement is not always possible. We've been relying on a false sense of circulation that's being put in question. But definitely, I think the Arab community here has organized and has it's much more vocal, has organizations, for literary organizations, political organizations. I mean, you have this. You're a major contributor to this. I mean, the Arab American Museum in Michigan, Detroit. So definitely you have this awareness. I mean, of course, in the US has a specific. We're kind of part of the mosaic of the American multicultural mosaic that where the Arab Americans are major contributors. Of course, that starts in the 19th century already with the first immigrants who came here, and some of them, are not recent immigrants. They are really kind of, we recognize the names, but many of them, have been here for multiple generations.
Thank you, Doctor. Yeah, continuing with, before we, I don't want to waste more time without getting into the some of the figures, which is the main title of this episode, which is the men and women of the Arab Renaissance that created Arab modernity. So, if you were to choose a person, or if you want to put a spotlight on a few individuals that played a crucial role in Nahda, and that can be an inspiration. They continue to be an inspiration for us today. Who would they be?
I've chosen like a couple of figures. I mean, in the anthology you mentioned, there are almost 30 contributions by these different figures. So I just want to give you a sense of who some of these people are and what they thought. And And we talked a little bit about Tahtawi, and I wrote about Tahtawi in my first book, Trials of Arab Modernity, who's a very interesting figure and founded Madrasat al-Alsun, School of Languages, when he came back from France. He was major figure in the Nahda. And of course, Egypt was a very important site. Of course, we have to think about Egypt and Muhammad Ali, who was the Khedive, the Pasha, the Ottoman Pasha, but then the Khedive, and eventually his dynasty keep ruling Egypt until 1952, until Nasser and the free officer take over. So you have, a state that is rising in Egypt in the beginning of the 19th century. And that state needed not only armies, but it also needed science, it needed translation, it needed engineering, and there was a big state production that required these expertise, that were bringing consultants from Europe, but eventually they started sending students to go to France to study, and Tahtawi accompanies one of those missions in 1826 and comes back and writes this amazing book about France, but also about Egypt and about his conception of what Egypt in the modern age should look like. And he becomes a major kind of agent in building schools and creating the institutions of the Nahda, which is very important. So, but that kind of, but Egypt is one of those stories where the Nahda kind of really is spurred by these kind of state-sponsored projects, big, large scale. I mean, Muhammad Ali eventually defeats the Ottoman Empire. I mean, really builds an amazing army, expands, and so on. In the Levant, in Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, you have, of course, it's connected to Egypt. You have a lot of also Levantines, or what they call Shawam in Egypt, who actually immigrate by the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, who contribute to this kind of, to this Nahda, or to this kind of cultural enlightenment. And even, we know from cinema, right? Sabah, I mean, all of them go to Egypt. Asmahan, I mean, they all go to Egypt. Like this, the cinema industry was very important, but that's a continuation of a tradition that goes way back. And in the Levant, you don't have a state project. You don't have a state project. You have a cultural project with an understanding of the nation, of nationalism, or of creating some sort of models of coexistence. And Usama Makdisi wrote a beautiful book on this called The Age of Coexistence about this issue. So in the Levant, for instance, you have someone like Boutros el-Bustani, originally Maronite, converts to Protestantism, also translates, one of the translators of the Bible, but also Boutros el-Bustani founds the Al-Madrasa al-Wataniya. Al-Madrasa al-Wataniya, he found it in Zaqlablat, in a neighborhood in Beirut, which was like the Nahda neighborhood, if you like. It's right outside of the city center, and Bustani founds Al-Madrasa al-Wataniya in 1863. And one of the things that Al-Bustani is interested in is creating this national educational model. Back then, every community taught its kids, whenever they taught that, right? I mean, education was not always so he and Bustani's Madrasa al-Wataniya, and of course he writes another book right before called Nafir Suriya, is a reaction to the civil war that happened in the mountain between Christians and Druze, the war of the two Bashirs, that led to genocide against Christians in Mount Lebanon, but also Damascus. So Bustani is trying to think, how do I prevent this from happening again? How do I create an educational model that allows us to transcend sectarianism as the main identity that people feel is the most important? How do we create a national identity? Wataniya, Madrasa al-Wataniya. And I want to read you just like a little section from khutbah fi Adab al-Arab, which is a lecture in the culture of the Arabs from 1859. So this is right before. And he says, "Oh compatriots," he says, "Oh compatriots, um, O offsprings of notables and grandchildren of Syriac and Greek kin, mounted on the camel's hump of the 19th century, the century of learning and enlightenment, the century of inventions and discoveries, culture and knowledge, the century of manufacturing and arts. Rise, hubbu, get up, be aware, wake up, inhadu, roll your sleeve up, your forearm of determination. Culture is standing at your doors from all sides, knocking, requesting entry into your majestic and radiant mountains, your valleys, your plains, and your deserts, which nature has decorated with lofty ornaments of beauty. Reject your sectarianism, partisanship, and personal prejudices, and outstretch your hand to shake the hand of culture. Open the doors of the old friend who is coming back to you after a long absence. Welcome it and greet it with utmost happiness, so that it can fill your land with contentment and comfort, and dress it in splendor and pride. So here you have the Nahda project as a project that is trying to control, counter, confront sectarian identities that just led to major wars between communities and genocide between communities. So here, the Nahda, the embrace of culture, the embrace of this new century is vital, is something, and it's not just simply West and Europe, or we have to be civilized to compete with, you know what I mean? It's not this discourse of we need to catch up with the West because they are superior and we are inferior, and or we are decadent and they are advanced. It is real need to confront the political problems that this part of the world, you know, Greater Syria, is experiencing at the time. So here, the Nahda is a reaction to and a project of forming a community that transcends sect and
And it's
transcends tribe.
amazing, Doctor, how he's calling for them to return to the values of their, Arab identity, while he's in the Ottoman Empire, and way
Yes.
before any political aspirations for independence in 1859. I mean, that's even before the Syrian science society, right?
Yeah. I mean, these people like Bustani, like a lot of the, you know, they're working within the Ottoman framework. So let's it's not like let's declare the dependent Lebanon. It's not that at all. But it is creating within this kind of Ottoman context, it's creating political models that ensure that ensure community models of community and collaborations
A
and
common
through
identity.
common identity through cultural production. So that's why you see it's not necessarily a contradiction that Arab or pan-Arab means against the Ottoman. These things could be working together sometimes,
Right.
and they don't necessarily contradict each other. And you have someone else like Abdul Qadir Kabbani, who founded the Maqasid, which still exists today, who studied in the Madrasa al-Wataniya, who's Muslim but studied with Bustani, who's Maronite, converted to Protestantism, uh, and founded, like one of the biggest charitable organizations in Lebanon. Um, so here you have different parties who are on the one hand speaking the language of culture and community, but they are not necessarily calling for an independent state. These things don't necessarily go together.
Right.
So I mean, they will at some point eventually.
They will eventually create a
Yeah,
political movement. Yeah.
yeah, but that's why there is a time. The Nahda cannot just be brushed with one brush stroke, because there are different moments and also different kind of ideas. The other person, I mean, to also move us a little bit from Egypt and the Levant and so on, is Fahmi al-Mudarris in Iraq, who is the founder of Al al-Bayt University in Iraq, in Baghdad, in 1922. And Fahmi al-Mudarris, who becomes really like the Minister of Culture, major figure. And for him, in the 1920s, you have the Ottomans on the one hand and the British, so the kind of the British are coming in to fill the Ottomans' place, right? They just defeated them in the First World War. So here he wants to create a university for the Iraqis to go to, so they don't have to go to Istanbul for university, because that's what they used to do, and also to counter the British colonial presence and so on. So here you have, again, like in between the old Ottoman model and the new kind of colonial structure, and trying to create a national identity through university building, through institutions of knowledge. This is a bit later. So you have like the idea of the education, culture, adab, word for culture that Bustani, or adab, the plural of adab, are language reform, are fundamental to kind of these kind of cultural revival projects, if you like, but also that don't always, are not the same as declaring a nation independence and kind of moving outside of either the Ottoman or staying with them or supporting them. So you have these kind of gray zones where these cultural projects and these cultural agents are asking for.
Thank you, Doctor. Yes.
The other Nahda agents that I would call, very important are the role of women in the Nahda as well, and kind of in terms of innovators of literature, in terms of journalists. I mean, not only talking about women's rights or women's issues, but also really kind of covering the whole, translators. I mean, really engaging in a variety of cultural activities and political activities that I think is important to kind of emphasize, because we also, the Nahda is really, there is an awareness also of gender and understood in a kind of a wider context. And you have someone like Zainab Fawaz, who is from Jabal Amel, and she moves, she gets kind of a rudimentary education where she is, and then eventually moves to Cairo and becomes a journalist, becomes an essayist, a speaker, and she writes a fantastic book, like a kind of a women encyclopedia, I mean, called Ad-Durr al-Manthur, Scattered Pearls, which is really kind of the who's who of the most famous women in history, which is amazing. That she produces that and becomes very, very influential on the feminist scene in Egypt, but also the cultural scene. Labiba Hashim, like major scholars who come after her are influenced and take up Zainab Fawaz's work and contribution. And here you have Jabal Amel, Cairo. I mean, you have these kind of connections that don't always also kind of come to mind when we think of the kind of centers of the Nahda. I mean, you have, or the agents of the Nahda. The other one is May Ziede, which many people have heard of. She had this salon. She had this very important kind of cultural majlis or salon where major Nahda thinkers and intellectuals used to come and debate. And again, May Ziede is Palestinian, Lebanese. Her parents moved to Cairo, and May Ziede was, she learned French. She read French philosophy, but also she was, engaged with, with women's rights movements. I mean, she was really someone who kind of embodied this kind of Nahda ethos. And I just want to write a little bit like this kind of proto-feminist text. I mean, not proto, but I mean really. And here she's talking about, this is a letter that she wrote to Malak Hifni Nasif, who's also another feminist activist, at the time. And May Ziedi, and I love this kind of, she says, man, this is from May's letter, man is a king whose throne is ready to fall, because the winds of chaos are blowing on all sides, while women's advancement gains progressively more ground as time goes by. But he is a dear king. He is a father, a brother, a friend, a fiance, and a husband. If he falls, we fall with him. And if he rises, we grow great with his ascent. This is why we wish him the best, and we work hard in support of his nation, provided he erects our throne next to his, and that we stand at his side as an equal. We want to be equal in our duties and responsibilities. Indeed, our duties and responsibilities already exceed his. I wonder when man will consent to this fact. I mean,
Wow.
look at the negotiation, right? Like, look at it's not as simple, like you're oppressing, it's a whole, there is psychology, there is the stick and the carrot, there is,
It's not confrontational. It's very wise and
it is, and it isn't, and it's so you have these people who are engaged in very sophisticated forms of trying to understand questions of identity, of gender identity, of Arab identity,
trying to redefine their identity too. Right?
Exactly. And these texts, like, imagine you as a reader, or imagine you as someone who's reading this or listening to this lecture by May Ziedi. I mean, it's not black and white. It's this very, there is giving incentive. She's admonishing, but also saying, but we care. I mean, she's going through all these different layers to get her point across, to
Convince.
exactly, to kind of get, or saying, we want equality, but we're already equal, but the man has not acknowledged it yet, but we know we are, like, so this is the Nahda. The Nahda is not, so the kind of debates about women's rights today, I mean, there is a whole tradition of modernity of those debates, that the Nahda, that we see with May Ziedi, that we see with Nazira Zainuddin, that we see with all these Nahda figures. I mean, questions of the veil and veiling, which, if you think about France, for instance, and the whole issue of the veil, and whether the veil, contradicts the ethos of the Republic. I mean, the whole thing. I mean, these debates were already happening in the 19th century and the early 20th century, and they were happening by these Arab women, or at least writing in Arabic and engaging in Arabic, these women who are engaged in that. They're not just simply now waiting for some, European scholar of feminism to kind of come and explain this to them. Like, there is a whole tradition, feminist tradition, that we forget about. And that's why I think it's also important to go back to these texts, because they're the kind of historical antecedent to the issues that we talk about today. So we don't think that we're either modern or traditional. We're already kind of going through these debates, and things are much more complicated than this. And the other person I want to mention, that when we think about identity, and to go back to what you said earlier about Arab identity as not necessarily being ethnic, or not being reduced to questions of ethnicity or religion, because of course here, and there were Christians, Maronites converted to Protestantism, Sunni, Shia, I mean, Druze, Nazira, and you had also Jews, and you had Jews who were from Beirut, who were from Egypt, who were major part of the kind of cultural scene, very active, writing in Arabic, studying Arabic. And I just want to read, from the anthology, just kind of a description of the life of one of these Nahda agents thinkers, activists, journalists, translators. Her name is Esther Azhari, and she was from Beirut and eventually married someone from Jaffa who's called Simone Moyal. And just like listen to what this woman did, and a remarkable woman of a remarkable woman of many talents. Esther Moyal, journalist, literary translator, author, and feminist, was born Esther Azhari in Beirut in 1873 to a Sephardi Jewish family of modest means. She was educated from a young age in classical Arabic, French, and English. In 1890 or 1891, she received an academic degree in Beirut, probably from the Beirut Female Seminary, later the American College for Girls, after which she taught at local Christian and Jewish schools. She was also active in the earliest associations for women in the Levant. In 1893, she was nominated to represent Syrian women at the Women's Congress at the World Columbian Exposition in Chicago. She would eventually publish in many of the mainstream Arabic language newspapers and journals of the era. Esther Azhari married Simone Moyal, a Palestinian Jewish doctor and writer who was active in Nahda circles. The Moyals moved to Cairo, where in 1899 Esther founded a journal for women, Al-Aila, the family, which ran through 1902 and was briefly revived as a newspaper in 1904. During the same period, she became a prolific translator of European works into Arabic with over a dozen published titles, most of them French novels, to her credit. She also published numerous short dramas for performances in Jewish schools and so on and so on. But just, I mean, if we think about someone like Esther Azhari in terms of her identity, religious identity, place of birth, the languages, the engagement. I mean, she, you know, in the anthology, I have this section where she talks about the Dreyfus Affair, which was a very important affair at the time, at the end of the 19th century, this French Jewish officer accused of treason. And then she's quoting Al-Mutanabbi to defend Dreyfus. You know, she's talking about Émile Zola, you know, who wrote a very important article, you know, called J'accuse, I accuse, to kind of defend Dreyfus. And here she's comparing Émile Zola to Al-Mutanabbi, you know, the most important, you know, knight Arab poets, you know, who stood up to power. I mean, he cuddled to power, but he also stood up to them. So French, classical Arabic, poetry, you're in a very, I mean, to say multicultural would be an understatement, right?
I mean, there's a term for them in English which is very appropriate, which is Renaissance man or Renaissance woman.
Yeah. And that tells you, this is, so for me, this is the Nahda. Like, this is the Nahda. That's why it's very hard. And it's the spirit where you have, where these things are not contradictory, where your place of birth or your religion don't determine the language you speak or the identity that you embrace or that you identify with.
Right.
That
the very important concept. Yeah.
Very important, that it shapes you. Of course, it shapes you, but also you make of these influences what you are able to make. There is also agency. You know, there is also what you make of yourself, and the kind of projects you embrace and the kind of effort you put in to, you know, to bring these influences, you know, that are your place of birth, that are your religion, that are all the things that you know you are born with, that you bring them and then you build on them and then you create something different, or you create something that moves them to another level.
Professor, you know, this a lot of the Nahda figures and their messages still resonate today. They're so powerful that they transcend their time, and it seems that the progress that they seeked have not materialized. that their message is still alive today. And if a person would not do but make the message of Nahda writers heard today, enough. That's enough of a mission
Yeah.
to do that. One of the and how relevant and how courageous are their words and their writings, that it exceeds the courage of today. With
Yeah.
much less restrictions today, it still exceeds the courage. Nazira Zainuddin, I mentioned it to you
Yes.
previously. Also, the writings that she had and the fight she had, she took on.
With the
Uh,
Mufti.
with the Mufti, she took on big religious figures by herself, and she wrote a Sheikh wal Fatat. She wrote a book, and she wrote the Unveiling and Veiling, the book Al Hijab was Sufur, which is a revolution. And she's Durzi. She didn't even worry. She didn't even worry about sectarian appropriateness. There is no such thing at that time. She's an Arab woman, and she is under, she lives in that culture, and the Islamic Arabic culture is part of her, so she has the right to speak against it. I loved how that's something that wouldn't happen today, and it happens at that time, and her book is probably feared till today, and it's probably also fought till today. She's probably fought till today, and the republication of her book, and the notion of speaking in that way, very respectful, but presenting your argument and talking about freedom as an ideal. Also, the influences of literature from Tolstoy, the Russian literature to Zola. These people were living in the whole world, and it's amazing for that time. I mean,
Yeah.
with the way the tools of communication at that time, how were these people so much in tune with Paris and London and Washington and New York and the jazz and the New York cafes and Moscow, and they were in tune. And today we have all these tools of communication, and we have people completely out of tune with the whole world. I mean, we have people here in Dearborn. I mean, we have people in Dearborn that are out of tune with the cities that are next to us. They're so it is really something that is astonishing and very inspirational
Yeah.
for us today. And I want to bring it because we're coming to an end, and we have these important questions: how to connect it with today. I know that there is a lot of figures we can go on and on, Doctor. And what you've done, actually, you've made this easy for us with this book, the Arab Renaissance, because of the selection of you took us in this tour, literally tool. I'm sure this book is going to be a main part of Arab American studies in any university, which we'll also talk about in a second. But first, Doctor, how relevant? How relevant is the topics of Arab Renaissance, which has
Yeah.
manifested itself into a political movement? This political movement was undermined very quickly with Psyche-Pico and the colonialism, and basically we were crushed by the weight of colonialism. Um, and then after that, we didn't really have a manifestation of the political aspirations of these values. And then we had the Nexa, and then we had the Age of Nexa afterwards. Um, do you feel that the age after, or let's talk about what was the result of the Arab Renaissance? Was there a manifestations of the results in the Arabic streets and cities?
We are the result of this Renaissance. The fact that we are here today having this conversation is a testimony to this Renaissance. I mean, people in Cairo and Beirut and Baghdad and the school systems and I mean, this is the Renaissance. This is and Renaissance is not just the Nahda is not just simply, doesn't necessarily have to translate like we saw into kind of a liberal state, independent, and all of that. Ideally, this should be, but the Renaissance is also a spirit. يعني spirit also to read, to inquire, to seek, and that's very important. And I think so. I mean, of course, if we reduce the Nahda to the political, like the Nahda failed because we did not produce independent state or independent of colonial powers or non-democratic, like all, of course, the catastrophes you've mentioned, the nakbas and naksas, and that you've mentioned have really, have really oppressed us, and colonialism that continues in different shapes and forms have really, countered this, and closed in many cases this spirit of wanting to meet the other, and engage the other, and learn, and take chances, and risk and take risks. So but I think also we have to look at, look at our literature, look at our, we've also done very well, we've also produced great things and great art. And so I don't want to, like, think of the rise and fall of the Nahda, you know what I mean? Like, I don't want to have the Nahda being put to being judged as a project that should have led to the kind of ideal states that some of these people were probably dreaming of. But I would have loved that, but it did not happen this way. But that doesn't mean that the Nahda did not have amazing influence and change things. Of course, there are also conflicts and reaction, various kinds of reactions, and interpretations of religion and of culture. And I mean, this all could be attributed to the Nahda. It's not all good, it's not all people who are the enlightened people that we are engaged with. I mean, we would like to kind of shed light on this tradition, but I think it's important to see the Nahda as something that is not a finished project, and that's something that we can continue, also make room for us to contribute to it, like to see what we are doing here as a continuation of the Nahda project, that it's an open project, and you can, different agents can come in at different times and contribute to it, and take part, if you get the rhythm, if you get the spirit, that Nazira and Bustani and these people, like, let's give me some money, let's found a school, let's clear out this monastery and then turn it into a school, or let's, give me the shop you have in downtown Beirut so we can, take it to pay for the endowment, for this new foundation we are starting. I mean, there's this kind of entrepreneurial spirit that I think is very important, and culture is at the center of it. And hopefully this will lead into a better political system. But we can't wait, or we can't just simply say, if it doesn't lead to this kind of political, transparent, to this kind of liberal democracy that people talk about, then we fail. No, we did not fail. Because if I fail, it means I'm not going to try, and I have to try.
Right. It's definitely a work in progress, and it has definitely built the infrastructure of which we're standing today. And we would like it to even more. I mean, I also feel it is not, there's not enough attention given to it. It's also kind of oppressed in that way. Doctor, there's something that I feel also is different between that age and our age today, which worries me, is that, first of all, there was a sense of one identity. You've touched upon that very clearly, that transcends the sects and transcends the geographical area, and there is this just given understanding of an Arab identity, or identity of this region. Today, that's in question. That's something that a lot of effort has been placed to weaken that, and it succeeded. And also another thing, that they were focused. And it's really, I had a friend who a few days ago sent me their, I'm not going to mention details, so they're not identified, but they're an anthropologist, and they've done a life worth of work on one of the Eastern Asian countries.
Hmm.
And I just thought to myself, you as an Arab American academic and scholar, I mean, we have a lot of need for such scholarship in our culture and identity and anthropology. We need a whole new renaissance and a lot of work needed. And I feel that a lot of Arab Americans, they're not focused.
Yeah.
There's a lot of academic effort, but it is not really focused on the need that can serve an Arab Renaissance.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, I think, um, in terms of a project, like I tried to say, like Egypt, there was this kind of state building kind of project. I mean, we also, we are in a different place, and and there's a lot of concern about the place we are in, for sure. Um, and although, we had the Arab Spring, where there was this kind of also, however people feel about it, there was a moment where when people take to the streets, and it's very important, and we need to acknowledge that. So I
Right,
don't want to also be too pessimistic and say we're kind of doomed, that's it, because it's important to believe in ourselves and believe that we can do something despite the odds, and despite the distance, and you know despite all the challenges that we are facing, and the rise of sectarianism, and the entrenchment of authoritarian rule, and what have you. So, but I think, we need to continue to be engaged, and we need to continue to try and do the things that we are doing. I mean, I cannot set a goal, a large liberationist goal in my mind. I can't like have a utopia of building this kind of perfect state, but I need to, within our spheres, and then eventually, and collaborate and create and amplify these networks and connect them, and in the hope that this will lead to a change, or that we will continue this project despite our uncertainty that it will succeed. Um, so it's important, like, to keep the faith
right.
in the value
No, I'm
of
definitely
this
optimistic.
kind of work. um,
I'm optimistic, doctor, and this program kind of tries to refocuses us
yeah,
on our identity, and also I feel that things are culminating into a new Arab Renaissance.
yeah,
We need a whole new episode to if we're going to talk about that, and I feel also there is an expiration on the colonial projects that there is getting there.
yeah,
And the Arab Spring is a very positive and healthy sign of that, although it was just a first breath, and there
yeah.
is much more breathing needed. So I'm very optimistic in that sense. But I wanted to ask you, as far as the possibility in terms of studying history, the possibility of, if we understand how Nahda happened and the factors uh, uh, from which Nahda has spurred, is there a way that we can actually induce or hasten a new Nahda? And what would do we need to do that?
Well, I mean, from what we saw, I mean, again, the first, you have to open yourself up to trying something different, to dare to take certain risk, right? I mean, like what these people are doing, and also to challenge what you think tradition is, because again, this is the tenet of enlightenment. I mean, you because what we're seeing here is that we have a modern tradition, but we forget about it, and we think that our tradition is only what so and so says our tradition is, especially for Arab Americans who are not always there to, to check for ourselves. So we need to be critical, we need to study, we need to read, we need to kind of have a wider as wide an understanding of this particular tradition as possible, and where we come from and who we are, and not kind of romanticize or settle for a simple version of our history, of our identity. I mean, it's what you're trying to do, complicating Arab identity, looking at it from all these different angles and different histories. So I think that's what we need to do to spur the Nahda. This is for me the Nahda. And take this seriously. Of course, we all want to. I mean, there is a lot of room for people to go and study history and to study literature and to study, to study the things that give us a window into who we are and how we have evolved and how we have formed these notions of identity that we think today are fixed. But they're not. They've been evolving and transforming, and we need to look at this evolution and transformation in order to put what we are going through in context. And then based on that, you come up with a strategy, you come up with a plan. You say, I want to take it further in this way and in that way and in that way. But we have to ground ourselves in this knowledge in order to devise strategies for the future.
Do you invite Arab Americans, Doctor, to encourage each other, encourage their children to study Arab American studies?
Oh yeah, I mean, these are my interlocutors. These are people I collaborate with. They are in my books. We just have a lecture series at Dartmouth on Middle Eastern Arabic literature. You have Huda Fakhreddin, who's coming to talk about her new book. You have I'm always engaged, obviously, with people who are who share my concerns and also who share my position, like in being here, producing knowledge within an American context, but also with an eye on the Middle East, with an eye on the Arab world, with an eye on, and I go back and forth, I give talks in Beirut, I travel to the region. I'm very involved culturally in what's going on there. So I'm not kind of just simply, restricted to my American academic context. I'm constantly doing this back and forth because that is essential. I cannot also just simply, it's essential to understand what is relevant to that region as well, and not simply to what we want to know about that region here. So, and that's part of, but it's important to study. It's important to go back to these things and learn about them, because we don't learn about them, and we don't want simple versions of identity and friends and foes, and like we need also kind of to arm ourselves with the complex picture that got us where we are and that hopefully will show us the road to the future.
Thank you, Doctor. Although I have many other questions, but as I promised you that I'm going to go over, but not more than 15 minutes. So with that, I'd like to invite my everyone who watches this episode, whether live or later on, if you can't read hundreds of books about that were written during Nahda, get the Arab Renaissance anthology and get a taste of all the writings at that time, because that will inspire you for sure to read for certain authors that you'll connect with the most. And with that, Doctor, that was an amazing meeting. I hope that we will host you again. I hope that you'll have availability for various topics that we can discuss together.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you for all the great work you are doing
Thank you.
with your podcast and everything to engage audiences with these topics. Thank you, Wissam.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you for all you do. I've been listening to your lectures also and your efforts. you're hundreds of individuals put into one, the amount of work that you do. So thank you very much.
Thank
And
you.
dear listeners and followers of Arab Identity and Arab American Center for Culture and Arts, please continue to follow us with upcoming episodes. We have next Saturday, we have Dr. Zaid Al-Fadil, who will be speaking about the secret Arab societies in the beginning of the 20th century at 1 p.m. We'll have more information on our website, and have a great night. Thank you, Professor, again.